Thank you very much. I remember very well the day Mrs. Thatcher gave the Bruges speech, after which this organisation is named. I was attending the Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting on your behalf and at your expense in Cyprus when the news came over the tapes that she'd made this speech, and all the Commonwealth ministers surrounded me and said, "What does it mean?" All these ministers representing former colonies and dominions. And I said, surely it's obvious to you. It's about us trying to get our independence back. I wonder whether any of them would have dreamt that in the process of getting our independence back, we'd have volunteered to pay £39 billion for the privilege. Would any of them? That we would have spent 2 years begging and pleading and conceding and giving way to reach this appalling agreement. Now, I'm not actually going to talk much about the agreement because I think my colleagues will tell you how appalling it is if you don't know already. I want to consider what happens if and when Parliament votes it down, as I hope it will. And I believe the government then should pursue a twin-track policy, simultaneously trying to renegotiate so that we can take up President Tusk's offer that he made on 7th of March this year of a Canada plus deal extended to the whole United Kingdom. But while we're doing that, in case they won't negotiate or those negotiations cannot be brought to a fruitful conclusion by the 29th of March, we simultaneously plan for WTO plus. Now, renegotiating the withdrawal agreement so that we can take up the Canada plus option means scrapping the Irish protocol and replacing it by a commitment by the British government, the European Union and the Irish government that under no circumstances will they erect infrastructure or carry out customs and other checks on the border. All of them individually have said that in the event of no deal, they will not erect infrastructure and carry out checks on the border. So let's have a commitment to that end, and then the whole paraphernalia of backstops and backstops to backstops disappears, and opens the way to us having a straight free trade agreement, which, as President Tusk himself said, is logically the only sort of agreement that we can have if, as we have pledged, we want to leave the customs union and the single market. So that's one strand of the government's approach, should be seeking a renegotiation of that kind, and another key feature of it would be that any financial commitment be made conditional on reaching such a free trade agreement. No deal, no money. The second track, which must be pursued simultaneously, not afterwards, not wait to see whether they'll come back and agree to renegotiate, is what I call WTO plus. That will involve us completing the preparations that are being made, and which actually are rather more advanced than I thought when I began looking at this, for leaving without a withdrawal agreement. Encouraging and persuading and informing businesses how they can prepare in the remaining months for a WTO plus agreement and trading on World Trade Organization terms. Inviting the EU to coordinate their efforts and preparations for a no withdrawal agreement outcome with our own. Actually, they are much further advanced in those preparations than many imagine, and in some respects they are cooperating and doing things which complement what we're doing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We should, of course, immediately guarantee and legislate to guarantee the rights of European citizens who are already here. They are our neighbours, our workmates, our friends. We don't want to cause them any prolonged uncertainty. And we should begin the process of novating or renegotiating the trade deals that we are party to as part of the European Union, where the European Union has free trade agreements and we want to continue to trade freely with those countries. Some portray it as a daunting task. There are supposedly 70 countries, if you count San Marino, Morocco, and Monaco and places like that. Most of them are rather small. But actually it's a less daunting task when you look at it. One single country, Switzerland, accounts for 50% of our trade under those agreements. The agreement with Switzerland, as I understand from speaking to someone at the Swiss embassy a little while ago, well advanced. I said, surely we could make some progress before we actually leave with this agreement. He said, but didn't you know we are? We have 8 work streams, 5 of them complete, 3 are nearly complete. I understand that that agreement ought, according to the Swiss, to be complete before too long. That counts for half the trade. Another 3 countries bring it up to 80% of the trade. That's South Korea, Turkey and Norway. So 4 agreements could settle the bulk of that trade, and most of the others are very keen to do likewise. Indeed, no single country has said that they don't want to negotiate with us, though one important country has said, what's the point until we know when you're going to leave, when you're going to have your own independent trade policy, and that you definitely are going to be outside of the customs union. You can't really blame them for that. Now, what are the pluses? Why is it WTO plus rather than just World Trade Organization terms? Well, first of all, we keep £39 billion to spend on our priorities to boost both our balance of payments and GDP. Those extra resources are equivalent to roughly 2% of our GDP over the next couple of years. Far from crashing out, we'd be cashing in. And whenever you hear anyone talk about crashing out, just say, no, we are cashing in £39 billion. What are you going to get for your £39 billion on your favoured Remainer-type option? Secondly, it ends uncertainty. The agreement the Prime Minister has negotiated perpetuates uncertainty for another 2 years or more. Even if companies don't necessarily favour this particular outcome, and there'll be some who benefit more than others and so on, everybody, once they know, will get on and invest to deal with problems and take advantage of opportunities. That pent-up uncertainty will be released. Thirdly, it will force the European and Irish governments, both of whom, as I said, like the British government, have said that they would cope without erecting infrastructure and having checks on the border, to do precisely that. So the Irish border problem would solve itself. And that brings the 4th plus, of my 3 pluses, that we would be in a much better position, to negotiate a Canada-style free trade agreement with the EU from a position of strength, the Irish border issue having solved itself, and us no longer being bound by the time schedules of Article 50. Now, there are advantages, of course, that apply to both the Canada +++ and the WTO +++ options, particularly once we're in charge of our own destiny and outside the customs union, we can abolish tariffs, particularly on goods we don't produce. Tariffs which force British consumers and businesses to subsidise inefficient producers on the continent. Instead, we'll be able to buy cheaper elsewhere, often from developing countries, helping them trade out of poverty. And we should start consulting now on what our tariff schedules should be, which we're going to eliminate, which we're going to reduce, and which we may want to keep. Secondly, of course, we'll be immediately able to negotiate trade deals with a range of countries who've indicated a willingness to do so. 90% of future trade growth, according to the European Commission's own trade portal, will be outside the EU. So that's where we should be looking for growth in future. And above all, and we often forget this, the real fruit is that we'll be able to streamline our regulation, maintaining high standards, but reducing the burden of compliance on our businesses and removing barriers to entry, which very often EU regulation imposes. So, although the media often portray the WTO option as something frightening and catastrophic, in fact, the WTO was designed to provide, and I know because I was, as Barry said, involved in the negotiations that set it up, It was designed to provide the basic framework within which countries would trade safely. It's a safe haven with guarantee that you'll be free from discrimination by other countries. They can't impose punitive taxes on you. They must offer you the most favoured nation tariff, the tariff they offer to other trading partners, except in events that they have trade deals with people. So we're guaranteed the most favoured nation terms, and it provides a dispute resolution procedure. The important thing to realise is that our trade with countries with which we trade solely on WTO terms has risen 3 times as fast as our trade with the single market since that was established. Now, I was responsible for both. I was involved in setting up the WTO. I was also the Secretary of State who had to introduce the whole single market programme. And I made extravagant claims and boasts about how wonderful each would be. It turns out, however, that my claims about the extra growth in trade that would come from the single market were much more extravagant than those I made about the extra trade we get from the WTO. So we shouldn't be too worried about that. Now, if we're on WTO terms, we will face tariffs. We'll face the common external tariff when we trade with Europe. And of course, if we keep their tariffs, they'll face the same tariffs coming to us. Well, what will that mean? Our exports would incur some £5 to £6 billion of tariffs on them going to Europe. That's equivalent to an average tariff of about 4%. Much less than the near 15% improvement in competitiveness which our exporters have enjoyed vis-à-vis Europe since the referendum because of the exchange rate movement over that period. So they'll still be, on average, considerably better off. It's also much less than our net membership fee of the European Union, which is 10 to 12 billion. Now, some people suggest it's worth paying to have access to the single market. But to pay 10 billion to save 5 billion does not strike me as a rational deal. And it's what we've been doing for the last 43 years. By contrast, if we apply the existing tariff to imports from the EU, they will have to pay not 5 or 6 billion as we'll have to pay, but 13 billion. Why so much? 2 reasons. One, they export far more to us than we export to them. And secondly, the goods that they tend to export to us are the most protected, those which operate within the high tariff walls that Europe surrounds itself with, like motor cars, food, clothing, and so on. So we will be free to buy those goods more cheaply elsewhere. I hope we will reduce our tariffs, particularly on things that we don't produce, but keeping some so that overall, for example, our agriculture faces no increase in obstacles worldwide, but nonetheless there's still some obstacle to the Europeans coming into this country with their goods. So, and we'd still, if we do slash our tariffs, be left with plenty of money to support those industries which will be, at least in the short term, hardest hit by facing European tariffs. Now, I've been looking at some of the scare stories which have been going around about what trading on WTO terms will involve. The extraordinary thing is, most of them involve the alleged problems we will face at importing things into this country from Europe, medicines, food, and so on. It is bizarre to assume that we are going to put obstacles in the way of things we want coming into this country. We're not going to do so, we will not do so. In fact, we're not going to put any new obstacles in the way of anything coming into this country. That may be a surprise to you, but that is what the head of the Customs and Excise has repeatedly told select committees. It doesn't get reported by the BBC or others because it sort of doesn't tie in with their game plan. But the Customs and Excise only carry out physical checks if there's some reason to do so. The reason may be because the customs computer chief, it's called, customs handling import and export for the use of, or something, chief, that analyses any customs declaration and works out whether there's something fishy about it. Is this product really coming from a place where they do lots of drugs and don't produce really the things they're claiming to import? And it identifies roughly 1% of all consignments coming into the country from outside the European Union as worthy of checks. In addition, there's sometimes direct intelligence which they get that they know about a particular smuggler or crook. What are we looking for? We're looking above all for drugs, for dutiable goods like tobacco and alcohol being smuggled into this country without paying that duty, and illegal immigrants. None of those will change. The riskiness of any consignment coming from the continent having an illegal immigrant abroad won't change. Having tobacco or cigarettes or alcohol won't change. So they do not anticipate any increase in the number of checks at our borders. So it is complete nonsense to suppose that there are going to be great hold-ups on stuff coming in. Now what about stuff going out to through Calais to France and the continent? Well, first of all, a third of the lorries going back are empty, I hate to tell you, because we export so much less than we import. So there's not too much problem for them handling empty lorries going back. But I've been looking at what our partners on the continent are planning to do. And they're taking very sensible and vigorous precautions. Going through the French Parliament at the moment, it's gone through the Senate, it's now in the National Assembly, is a piece of legislation which empowers the French government to take all necessary act. First of all, to secure the rights of British citizens in France. They're going ahead and doing it. Like I say, we should be doing conversely for European citizens here. But also to take all necessary action to ensure the smooth flow of goods and the rights of British firms established in France and their subsidiaries and so on. So they're taking all that necessary action. And the minister concerned, Gérald Darmanin, is going around saying we've got to do this, because if we don't, we'll lose trade to ports up the coast, Zeebrugge, Antwerp and Rotterdam. And the prefect for the Hauts-de-France region around Calais said it would be economic suicide for them, deliberately or through lack of preparation, to allow bottlenecks to develop at Calais. So they're doing all they can. The French government is acquiring a scanner which will be able to scan trains going into the tunnel, even when they're moving at 30 kilometres an hour. So we shouldn't assume that that our partners on the continent are out to get us. They know that getting us will cost them a lot, and by and large, they are law-abiding people. Indeed, one of the problems we have with the European Union is essentially its construction of laws. It's a legal entity. It's far harder for them, actually, I mean they do succeed from time to time, to do things which are illegal than it is for us if we want to. Well, we don't, of course, but we could easily pass an Act of Parliament in Labour's to do almost anything we wanted to. They find it much more difficult and are very unlikely to do so. So then both on imports and exports things are right. Now what about aeroplanes? We heard an awful lot about aeroplanes not being allowed to fly. What you won't have heard, because you're reliant on the BBC and other people for your news, is that the European Commission issued a paper on the 13th of November, so obviously it's taken a little time to get through to the news desk, saying, regarding traffic rights, the Commission will propose measures to ensure that air carriers from the United Kingdom are allowed to fly over the territory of the European Union, make stops as well as land in the European Union and fly back to the United Kingdom. Those measures will be subject to condition that the United Kingdom applies equivalent measures to air carriers from the European Union. Very sensible measure. It's going to be resolved. As far as aviation safety is concerned, where components and whatnot on planes and everything have to be certified, the Commission will propose measures ensuring continued validity of such certificates. Certificates are offered before we leave for a limited period of time, to give us time to set up appropriate validating bodies out there. And likewise, the Commission will propose measures ensuring that parts and appliances placed on the Union market before the withdrawal date their certificates are recognised and so on. You'll be pleased to know this if you're planning to go on holiday and carrying lots of baggage, going to operate the system that will prevent, because just straight application of the law would mean that you would have to go through a second security screening if your plane stops in Frankfurt on the way to Moscow or wherever. Now we will be entitled to the one-stop security system with just one check on your baggage when you get on the plane. So lots is happening, both on the continent and in here, in this country, to ensure that no deal is not a problem. One reason it appears to be a problem is not just that the media is dominated by Remain-supporting organs, but it is dominated by journalists. And journalists have a déformation professionnelle, as the French say, that they know they can't sell a newspaper, as I think it was William Hurst said. You can't sell a newspaper with a headline, "Small earthquake in Chile, no one hurt." You have to have, if it bleeds, it leads. It's got to be something scary and painful. So that even newspapers which are sympathetic to Brexit have to highlight the scare stories. That's what they have to do. But it's up to us to say, yep, that was something to worry about, but action's been taken. That's not going to materialise. My guess is that if we do leave with no withdrawal agreement, it will be quite as big an issue for us as the millennium bug was. That's assuming we do take vigorous action between now and then, businesses comply. And I remember that only 2 months, I think it was, before the turn of the millennium, Tony Blair was saying this is such a frightening prospect. He would be ready to call out the army and mobilise the territorial army to deal with the disruption he anticipated. So when people make sort of similar statements about there being a lot to fear, just remember Tony Blair, if you can bear to.
Don't worry, folks, this is not my notes. Otherwise, you could be here to the end of the transition agreement period. After about 15 years' time, the way this agreement is going. But can I, first of all, thank the Bruges Group for the invitation to come here and speak tonight. Because, of course, Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland MPs have become a focus in all of these Brexit decisions and in all the Brexit debate. At one stage it was thought that all of this would hang upon the votes of 10 DUP MPs. To be quite truthful, we could stay at home next Tuesday. We could spectate from the gallery, because such is the anger against this agreement that it is not just Northern Ireland MPs who are going to be voting against it. From the Remainers, to the Leavers, to the Corbynites, to the Scottish Nationalists, Sinn Féin with kilts on, the Liberal Democrats. I know they've all got different reasons. If you took it last December, if you took it against very serious warnings from ourselves, when she fell for the con trick that somehow or other the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic was so unique that you could not possibly have the United Kingdom leaving the EU unless they kept some link to the customs union, the single market, EU regulations, and if the UK didn't keep those, then Northern Ireland had to be separated off from the rest of the United Kingdom, and they had to fall under that regime. And that basically is where all of the problems about this agreement have rested. Now, I could give you many reasons. I mean, because this agreement is amazing. If you go through it, the government, and this is how it starts. This is a legally binding, and this is the important thing about this agreement, folks. It is legally binding. It requires the government to do certain things. And there are 587 pages of things that they've got to do. And it starts off, they shall take all appropriate measures, whether general or particular, to ensure the fulfilment of the obligations in this agreement. And, you know, and it's right down to, and I'm not joking you when I say this, we have got to keep on pumping out EU propaganda. We are not allowed to say bad things about the EU in international trade and international organisations. We've got to abide by the rules, and of course, if we extend the period that we're in the EU, then whatever budgetary contributions we make after that will be simply told, there's the bill, pay it up. We have no say in the size of the budget, and we have no say in the size of the budget which is handed us. But I want to deal just particularly with the backstop arrangement. But of course, that has become the whole central point of this. And it's what has annoyed those who want to remain in the EU, and what has annoyed those of us who want to leave the EU. Because the argument runs like this, that where you've got a land border, now I don't see any distinction between a land border and a sea border. The same things have to be done when trade's crossing, whether it goes through ports or goes down a road. But where you've got a land border, then there are particular difficulties that have to be dealt with. You cannot have a land border with the EU without having checks on it, and they argue that the Belfast Agreement says you cannot have a hard border. Now, the Belfast Agreement doesn't actually even mention a hard border. It doesn't mention a border at all. It doesn't mention the EU, apart from the fact that the EU was going to give us a pile of money. And that money mostly went to paramilitaries, which was even worse. But but this was sold, that somehow or other you would be contradicting the Belfast Agreement if you had a hard border. And of course that begs a second question. What do you mean by a hard border? I've asked this question many times. Now, does it mean you put a couple of barber poles across the main roads between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and lorries have to stop at them, and you look inside the lorries to see what's in them? Or does it mean that every road has to be blocked? All 360 of them? We tried that during the Troubles, with 50,000 troops, with watchtowers. We blew up roads. We put concrete bollards on them. We had patrols along the border. Oh, we did everything but mine it. And they still brought cattle across it, and cigarettes, and drink, and guns, and bombs, and terrorists. So what do we want? And Leo Varadkar, of course, in one of his more rhetorical moments, he said, I'm not going to have a Berlin Wall round the border. Nobody said yes, have a Berlin Wall round the border. And who's going to build it? But you know, what do you mean by a hard border? Now, this is where the nonsense we've got to, folks. Because when some of those who wish to remain in the EU came along to the Brexit Committee a number of weeks ago, and it was pointed out to them that, look, there are many ways in which the trade can be monitored across the border as it is at present. I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment or two. And I suggested to them that it may require some more administrative arrangements, where they would have some forms to fill in, some additional forms. That was regarded by some people as a hard border. Not that you filled the forms in at the border, but you sat in your office and filled these forms in. That's how ridiculous this argument has become. From having gunmen on the border to patrol it and stop the lorries getting across, to signing a bit of paper. None of it's acceptable. And I come to the conclusion when I hear that the hard border argument is not about any friction in trade. It's not about facilitating the movement of trade across the border. It's all about finding ways of keeping us in an arrangement that the EU doesn't want us out of. And they have devised a means of doing it. Either, and this is what the backstop now says, either the whole of the United Kingdom stays in an arrangement whereby you're bound to the customs union, you're part of the customs territory, and you can't make your own trade deals, or else Northern Ireland is separated out. Either way, the United Kingdom is punished. The voters of the United Kingdom as a whole are punished by not being able to have the views which they express at the referendum exercised, or else the United Kingdom is punished by forcing its break-up. Now, as a unionist, and as someone who, and I don't like playing in this, but you know, all of my years in politics, since I first entered politics, the union has been under threat from terrorism. And you know, many of my colleagues were actually shot, some of them injured, some of them killed. Threats were made against me. The police warned me on many occasions. My house had reinforced glass, and I had to look under my car in the mornings to see if there wasn't a bomb and everything else. And I don't complain. I mean, that was part of it. But we did that, and we went through that. Because being part of the United Kingdom, with all of the historical connections, with all of that meant what that meant, being part of the 5th largest economy in the world, and having the freedoms which that entailed, were worth paying the price of standing up to terrorists for. And the one thing which irks us is that some bullying bureaucrats who want to punish the United Kingdom think that they can break up the United Kingdom. And for a part of the United Kingdom which has stood up to terrorism will have to fall under the whip of what Brussels want in order to make the United Kingdom pay the price for daring to want to leave. And we will resist this, and we will work with whoever we have to work with to resist it. Because if Northern Ireland goes, I can tell you, the Scottish nationalists are sitting, waiting, looking to see what are the lessons for Scotland and how can they capitalise on it. But the backstop arrangements, in my view, are not necessary. First of all, as I say, a hard border is not practical. But not only is it not practical, it is not necessary. What do you have to do at a border? Now, this is assuming, of course, and this is why the whole thing was back to front. Before we even knew what the future trade arrangement was, we were assuming that we had to collect taxes. We had to check goods. If a future trade arrangement was, as the government promised they were looking for, was tariff-free and quota-free, then of course there was no need to collect taxes. But there are 3 things that you need to do at a border. The first one is this: you've got to, if there are tariffs to be collected, if there are different rates and a common external tariff or what, you've got to collect taxes. That's already done across the Northern Ireland border. We have different rates of VAT. We have different excise duty. We have different corporation tax. We have different currencies. Now, we don't get lorries and vans stopped at present. There are according to the Irish government, there are 1,600 vehicle movements across the border every day, which entail carrying goods across the border. Not all of them would have any tax imposed on them. But that tax is collected. Diageo, who make Guinness in Dublin and bottle it in Belfast. They make Baileys in Belfast and sell it through the Irish Republic. They have 29,000 vehicle movements a year. Many of those, in fact, the most of those, will entail movements which require payments to be made. And how How do they do it? They simply give notification that we're taking these goods across the border, there's a duty, and every 3 months that duty is collected. I remember saying to the guy in Diageo, well, are you not tempted? I remember saying this to the guy in the HMRC, the Permanent Secretary in the HMRC, when he came to talk to us. Is there not a temptation to say, well, we'll not declare it and we'll avoid the tax? And he made me, the Permanent Secretary of the HMRC said, look, do you think that every tax demand is checked? We get millions of tax demands. Now, you're going away now and not tax, right? We get millions of tax demands every year. And millions of tax payments. We depend upon people declaring honestly what they owe, but of course they know the penalty, that if they're checked up and they are found to be defrauding, then we can go back years. There are penalties we pay. And Diageo said, that's the answer Diageo gave to me. He said, why would we risk that? We want movement across the border. We want to have the easiest way of paying our due and our tax and everything else. We would not risk the trusted trader status we have in order to do that. So taxes can be collected. Now, taxes can be collected at present. While we're okay, we're still part of the EU, but the principle of collecting taxes without stopping vehicles, without having a hard border, is already established. Why can that not apply if we are outside the EU and there's a common external tariff and goods come into Northern Ireland and we take them to the Republic and there's a tariff we pay? Well, you simply do the same as you do at present with VAT and with different excise duties. The second reason why they say you need to have checks at the border is because different goods may not comply with the regulations. They might not comply with health and safety regulations, they might not comply with agricultural regulations or whatever. Now, the EU trades currently with countries all over the world. Africa, South America, China, America. None of those areas of the world are in total conformity with EU regulations. Containers come in every day. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of thousands of them every year. Millions of them probably every year. Do you think every container that comes in animal checks? And I accept, and I mean the island of Ireland, especially with the high dependence on agriculture, we do and we are very, very aware of biosecurity. And in fact, this is the excuse the government has made for having different regulations, EU regulations applying to Northern Ireland and not applying to the rest of the United Kingdom. They say, well, there's different regulations already. They're not different regulations. There are checks already. Yes, there are checks. But those are checks to make sure that the rules on animal health which apply in GB are adhered to. And because the animals come through one focal point, you can check, have they got TB, have they got any other disease, so that the bios... But it's only to ensure conformity of regulations which exist in both parts of the United Kingdom. The other argument that's made is, I assure you people in Northern Ireland with devolution, you have different social legislation, you have different legislation on abortion, you have different legislation on gay marriage, and different legislation on a whole lot of other things. Yes, we do, but that's devolution. That's a choice that is made. What we have in this agreement is not a choice that the government of Northern Ireland would make. What we have in this agreement is that rules and regulations made in Brussels would automatically apply, whether they were good, bad or indifferent for Northern Ireland. Now, apart from the constitutional arrangements, and I don't want to go into that too deeply tonight, there are significant economic disadvantages because this whole agreement is predicated on making sure that there's an open border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Our trade with the Irish Republic, or indeed with the EU as a whole, is about 14% of our total exports. The rest of our trade is with GB and with the rest of the world. And yet, if this agreement goes through, and the legal note which the Attorney General has issued indicates today that if one of the problems with these regulations, the backstop recognises that such an arrangement has the potential to lead to, one, a form of friction in trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, our biggest market. 5 times more trade goes to GB than goes to Europe, and also to cause trade distortion. So economically this is not good for Northern Ireland. And of course the other thing is that if, and I could understand why a future government may well say, we are sick and tired of the UK-wide backstop restricting us in what we can do and the freedom we can have in changing our regulations to suit more the circumstances of today, and being tied that we cannot have a customs arrangement, and may well decide we now want out of that. And if that happens, then of course the barriers between Northern Ireland go up further and further, and the agreement makes it quite clear that Northern Ireland, which is more export orientated than any other part of the UK economy because we've got such a small local market. You may not know it, we produce 1/3 of all of the seats that are made for aircraft. So if you sit in rows C or F, you're probably sitting in a seat that was made in Northern Ireland. We produce 40% of the stone crushing equipment that's produced for the whole world. That's exported all around the place. And I could go through lots of other examples because we're an export-oriented economy. But yet we would find ourselves unable to participate in trade deals that the UK would make with the growing parts of the world because we will be tied to the EU customs union. Folks, I don't want to prolong it any longer. I could say a whole lot more, but I don't want to prolong it any more. We will be voting against this agreement next Tuesday. Suggested the Prime Minister brings it the following week, we'll be voting against it the following week. And she can bring it forward on Christmas Day, and we'll be here on Christmas Day to vote against it as well. Because it's not just a bad deal for Northern Ireland. This is a bad deal for the United Kingdom. And it does not honour the referendum. It does not honour the pledges which were made in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2017. It does not honour the promises which the Prime Minister made in our Lancaster House speech, or our Florence speech, or our White Paper. And if we're going to have any trust in the people who we send out to negotiate for us, then they've got to deliver on the promises that they made. And if they can't deliver on that, then let somebody else do the job.
Well, yes, I better adjust the mic because I am actually the tallest ever Member of Parliament at 6'9", and of course anything over 6'8.5" is officially a giant. But yes, I am the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament. And we came to this country in 1978 because my parents fled the tyranny of communism and all the consequences that communism had on Poland. And so I have lived in a country which has zero sovereignty, a vassal state, a complete vassal state, a satellite nation, a nation that was not controlled internally, but by controlled another country overseas. And when I was standing to be the parliamentary candidate for Shrewsbury, somebody said to me, my name is Kawczynski, but somebody at the end of the audience said, well, Kawasaki. Kawasaki, that's not a very Shropshire name, is it? How are you going to get on with a name like Kawasaki? And I said, well, it didn't cause my grandfather's generation of Poles who were fighting in the Battle of Britain any problems. So I hope it doesn't cause me any problems this evening. And they all cheered at that. But you know, there are two films at the moment, and in exchange for me coming to address you here, I would like to ask you to go and have a look at one of them. One of them is called the Hurricane movie, the other one is called the 303 Squadron, and it outlines the unique contribution of Polish fighter pilots to the Battle of Britain. Britain was a beacon of hope in 1940, not just for Polish pilots, but for pilots from all over occupied Europe. And the 303 Squadron, the Poles who came here, they shot down more enemy aircraft than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. They were, in many ways, kamikaze. Their country had been taken over, their women folk brutalized by the Germans, Warsaw 95% destroyed. They had nothing to lose. And they came here to the United Kingdom to carry on that struggle for freedom. And many of them, along with their British counterparts, gave up their lives in order so that we can have freedom today. And the most important thing in my parliamentary career was an evening at the RAF Club with Lord Tebbit who served along Peter Lilley, and he said something very important. There was an Anglo-Polish dinner at the RAF Club. Half the table were Poles, the other half English. And he said, well, you know, you can replace the planes relatively easily, but you can't replace the pilots. It takes a long time to train up the pilots. And he said that the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe was so evenly matched in the summer of 1940 that it was the Poles coming here that tipped the balance to win the Battle of Britain. Baroness Trumpington, many of you will know, who died recently, worked at Bletchley. And also the Poles were at Bletchley. Many Polish mathematicians came to Bletchley and were instrumental in breaking the Enigma codes, which also, we believe, shortened the war significantly. So I say those things about Poland, really, because I want you to understand where I am coming from as a Polish-born British Member of Parliament, a man who loves both countries, a man who is loyal to Britain but also to Poland. But when I was standing to be an officer in the Navy, they said to me, well, Kawczynski, the Polish ship is sailing towards us, firing on us, what do you do? And this was the summer of 1990. And I said, well, that's not fair, because communism has just fallen. And he said, he used a rather rude word, cut the Kawczynski, Poland's still in the Warsaw Pact, because you remember there was an interregnum after the fall of communism, there was still the Warsaw Pact. And I said, well, sir, I would issue the order to fire. And I think that is very, very important for those of us who have come to this country from overseas to show the passion and the loyalty and the dedication that we have for this country that has given so much to us. Now again, under very different circumstances, we are a beacon of hope to hundreds of millions of our fellow European citizens across the whole of the continent of Europe. These Eurosceptics who also, like us, have serious reservations about the direction of travel of this organisation and about the loss of sovereignty for their countries. What will happen to them if the United Kingdom caves in or surrenders? The fifth largest economy in the world, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a country that has given, according to the House of Commons Library, over £300 billion of your money in net contributions since we joined. What hope is there for these other countries if the United Kingdom caves in and continues, as Sammy has said, to be part of this structure and leaving in name only? We are going to show that they can stand up to the loss of sovereignty, stand up to the bullying that they have experienced, and stand up to the threats that they constantly get from the unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats in Brussels. And I go back now, I'm a fluent Polish speaker. It's one of the most difficult languages in the world, but jak się masz? There you are, well done, extra points. That's how are you in Polish. But I go back to Warsaw more and more, and I'm already meeting with the Eurosceptic caucus in the Polish Parliament. Think about this, a massive net contributor of EU funds, and yet already they have their own cross-party Eurosceptic caucus in the Polish Parliament. And do you know what they say to me? They say to me this: if we had 1.2 billion people in the world who spoke Polish, if we had 58 countries across the world in a Commonwealth that were aligned to us, if 20% of the world spoke Polish, we too would be leaving the European Union. But they are, ladies and gentlemen, already experience an extraordinary amount of interference in their domestic affairs. I haven't got the time to explain to you all of the extraordinary issues, all of the threats that the Polish government is coming under over various issues. But the Polish government has been democratically elected by the Polish people, and they are directly accountable to the Polish people, not the bureaucrats in Brussels. And this is what they don't understand. Poland is very sensitive to this outside interference because they have had no sovereignty for so many generations. Now, the idea that they're going to be dictated to by Brussels is something of great concern to them. I wanted to speak very briefly about the worries for the rest of the European Union moving towards a supranational state and how we must be the beacon for them, and why the decision next week will be pivotal in us being able to be that beacon for them. But before I say that, I'd like to pay tribute to all of you in this room, because it was you in 1999 who forced the politicians to keep our pound sterling.
Yes.
Do you remember that debate nearly 20 years ago? It wasn't Gordon Brown who saved the pound sterling. It was, if you go back 20 years, so many people were coming up to me. I wasn't even the Member of Parliament at that time, but in my constituency, so many people said, carry on with your European Union project, carry on sending £200 million of our money every week to the European Union, but you're not going to give up our currency.
Yeah.
That is a step too far. That is a loss of sovereignty for the United Kingdom, which is moving too far, and we are not going to allow you to ditch our currency. So I pay tribute to you and the Bruges Group and every other organisation that helped that to materialise, because if it hadn't, I'm absolutely convinced that in the referendum that we had 2 years ago, that referendum may have been lost. With Operation Fear or Operation Terror, can you imagine how close the referendum was? There would have been people in our society who would have been petrified at the prospect of pulling out of the European Union and changing our currency at the same time. It would have been too complicated, too problematic. So the fact that we've kept our currency, one of only two countries with a permanent opt-out from the Eurozone, is absolutely instrumental today in our ability to reject this deal and become a sovereign nation state again. There are 19 Eurozone countries, but there are another 8 countries that have no rights not to join the Eurozone. When they joined the European Union, they signed a document which stated that at some stage in the future they will have to abandon their currencies. But I have to say to you, in the Czech Republic, 71% of the electorate don't want to give up their currency. In Sweden, it's 72%. And in the country of my birth, Poland, 62% of the electorate do not want to abandon their currencies. And do you remember what Helmut Kohl said when he was interviewed, the late German Chancellor? I knew I would lose a plebiscite on getting rid of the Deutschmark. I knew the German people would not tolerate losing the Deutschmark, so we just introduced it anyway. And that has always been the case, that the people don't know what they're doing, and we have to make decisions on their behalf for their betterment. And now, also, they're talking about a single European army. I have to tell you that I take my daughter, Alexis, every year to the Polish-Russian border, to the seaside there, and I say to her, darling, this is the most highly militarized part of Europe, the Polish-Russian border, where NATO meets Russia. If the tit-for-tat military deployments, the missile deployments, continue at the pace that they have done over the last 10 years, this is going to be the European equivalent of the North and South Korean border. The tensions and the difficulties that are now starting to surface with Russia, one cannot begin to underestimate. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, what is it that has kept the peace on the continent of Europe for the last 70 years? NATO. An organisation that hasn't lost a square inch of territory since its inception 70 years ago. In the referendum that we had, some constituents came up to me in Shrewsbury and said, well, Mr. Kawczynski, we're going to vote to remain because the European Union has kept the peace. Has kept the peace on the continent of Europe. I had to sit them down momentarily and explain to them why it was NATO. And the EU army, ladies and gentlemen, and the reason I tell you this is because the situation is so serious. The EU army, at best, will duplicate NATO, and at worst, it will usurp the supremacy of NATO on our continent. We've heard already the French president saying that they need to protect themselves against America. A country that has sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men in 2 world wars to liberate that country. And think about the 6, when we pull out of the European Union, think about the 6 countries that are members of NATO that are not members of the European Union and never will be. America and Britain, 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Canada and Iceland, helping to keep the Atlantic open in the event of a war between America and Russia. Norway in the extreme north, Arctic. Turkey, protecting our southern flank from ISIS. No, ladies and gentlemen, we must work with like-minded countries like Poland and others to ensure that we maintain NATO as the supreme defence posture. And then people say to me when I go to Brussels, what's it got to do with you? You're pulling out of the European Union. It's none of your business. My answer to them is, there isn't a single village in Shropshire that didn't lose men during the First World War. 731,000 British men lost their lives in the First World War, 432,000 in the Second World War. I take great exception to comments like that, and everybody in Europe must realise that the United Kingdom will always protect Europe, no matter what, because we know that we will never have our liberty unless the whole of Europe is free. I wouldn't be so worried about them taking over the defence of the continent of Europe if they weren't so efficient in all the other things they were doing. The EU, in my view, I quote this to my constituents, as the opposite of the Midas touch. Anything it touches turns to dust. Look at the catastrophic mismanagement of the situation in Greece. Look at the appalling mismanagement of the refugee crisis from Syria. Look at their inability to deal with the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, with hundreds of thousands of people coming across and many lives being lost with the smugglers. And look at the Eurozone crisis. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, these people being responsible for the defence of our continent? I shudder at the thought. Now, I'm going to wrap up, but I want to say to you 2 things why I'm going to vote against this deal. One of them is the Northern Ireland backstop. I've just come from a 2-hour meeting with the Attorney General, who was speaking to us on the floor of the House, and he could not give me sufficient guarantees about our friends in Northern Ireland, that somehow, if we don't secure an agreement with the Europeans, that they will not be used as some sort of sacrifice or some sort of pawn to be somehow trapped away from the United Kingdom. and we questioned him sufficiently. He said that it's a risk, and it's something that we have to consider. It's a risk I'm not prepared to take. We owe the DUP an extraordinary honour, blood honour. I was reading the other day, Sammy spoke about some of the things that he's been through. I was reading the other day an article about how Arlene Foster's father was shot and had to crawl back onto their farm, all blooded. And Arlene, Mrs. Foster, saw her father riddled with bullets on the farm. What these people have been through, to maintain and safeguard their British identity is absolutely remarkable. Yeah. I've never seen, I don't have anything like the experience of Peter Lilley, but I've only been a Member of Parliament for 13 years, but I've never seen, in those 13 years, the amount of raw emotion, genuine concern, and absolute determination from any other members of Parliament than is emanating at the moment from the DUP, with all of their convictions, all of their determination, that their part of the United Kingdom will not somehow be wrought away from the rest of the country. And the Attorney General, I looked at him when the Attorney General looked at the DUP benches, and he said to them this evening, you have to vote for the interests of the whole of the United Kingdom. Well, I have a message to you, Geoffrey. The United Kingdom doesn't exist without Northern Ireland. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, as a Member of Parliament, you see extraordinary difficulties in the constituency that you represent. People think of Shrewsbury as some quiet, and we had the honour of Peter Lilley coming to Shrewsbury the other week and addressing us. People think of Shrewsbury as a quiet little sleepy Shropshire town, famous for its flower show and river loop and all the rest of it. I have to say to you, I can take you to schools in my constituency with leaking roofs, poor insulation, where they're making cutbacks to teaching assistants. I can take you to the local Royal Shrewsbury Hospital, where there are people still on trolleys at peak winter times because there are not enough beds for them. And yet we are handing over £200 million of your money every week to an organisation that hasn't had its account signed off for 24 years in a row. And when I spent an hour with the Attorney General on the telephone asking him about the £39 billion, when he was talking to me, he said to me last week, I said to him, how much of this £39 billion do we really owe? That was my question. That was the question I wanted him to answer as the Attorney General. He said to me over the telephone, I reckon that legally speaking, we probably owe them £8 billion. 8 billion. But today, on the floor of the House of Commons, when he answered from my friend Philip Davies, the MP for Shipley, the very same question, he said it's very difficult to calculate. I suggest you look in Hansard, and then I continued to probe him, and I said, well, how can you ask us, when we have so many shortages in our own constituencies, how can you ask us to vote for £39 billion of your money to be transferred when you cannot give me a genuine legal opinion as to what it is that we genuinely owe them? And what I suspect, although I can't prove it, but what I suspect the 39 billion, or I should say the 31 billion, and by the way, the 8 billion is challengeable anyway, according to Geoffrey Cox. What I suspect is, do you know what I suspect this is? This is a bribe for a possibility of a maybe. For a possibility of a maybe trade agreement. So the European Union has been working with Mercosur, the organisation in Latin America for the last 8 years on the trade agreement. And today we have Monsieur Macron telling us that he may veto that trade agreement because the new Brazilian president wants to pull out of the Paris climate change agreement. Can you imagine those circumstances where we have handed over £39 billion of your money, and then 2 years on after the transition period we still haven't got a trade deal with these people? These people are coming under more and more pressure. What do you think the British electorate would think of the Conservative Party then? It would destroy the Conservative Party. So, for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I have informed my whip this evening that I will be voting against the agreement. Thank you.
Order.